Gendered wounds that clamor for healing. At the outset, I would like to place on record my appreciation to CWCIT of DePaul University for including the question of gender and sexual violence in its deliberations on Catholicism and health across the globe. In this panel, since we are focusing on healing trauma and invisible wounds, I think first and foremost we need to ask why some wounds remain invisible. Wounds gain visibility depending on where they are inflicted, who or what is responsible for causing them, and what is the socio-cultural setting of the afflicted person. While wounds caused by domestic violence may have physical visibility, women tend to mask the reasons behind their injury. This being the case, it is not surprising that wounds resulting from sexual violence would remain most invisible. Trauma that is consequent to gender violence goes beyond the question of visibility. Women who are trapped in the gendered molds cast by patriarchy find themselves totally confused and powerless in situations of intimate partner violence or incest within the domestic space. Some years ago, when I was working with an organization called Strivani in Pune, a woman from the locality close by came to our center. Strivani signifies voice of women. So it is an NGO that is focusing totally on women's empowerment, women's rights, etc. So this woman was bleeding profusely from a fresh deep cut on her forehead. After giving her first aid, when I accompanied her to the hospital, I told her that after getting her wound dressed, we could go to the police station and put a complaint against the perpetrator, who was none other than her husband. She held my hand tightly and pleaded with me in loud sighs not to register a police case against him. I was wanting to file a case knowing that he was an alcoholic and a regular abuser, and I feared that her life would be in danger if he would get into, as he would get into frequent bouts of rage. But her reasoning was different. For her, it was important that she safeguards the honor of the family, particularly of her children, as it would put them to shame to have their father sent to jail by their own mother. And she felt that she had to protect their respect even at the risk to her own life. When women are afflicted by sexual violence like rape, they go through unspeakable difficulty in voicing their experience as their trauma is deeply tangled by a sense of shame, guilt, denial, and anger. It becomes evident then that physical rape is but one aspect of the total rape experience, since the psychological, emotional, and spiritual implications of the ordeal weigh heavily on them. Many women succumb to silencing because the penalties of complaining are too high. The silence, whether self-induced or due to external threats, serve to fuel the invisibility of their torment, and this in turn makes them vulnerable to further abuse. I now want to look at the traumatic, what I call the traumatic underbelly of invisible wounding. In the secular society, the Me Too movement has served to help has helped to crack the hardened shell of silencing to some extent. Yet, women recoil from divulging their anguish if the abuse has religious undercurrents. That I mean, if it is within religious frameworks or domestic frameworks. I take the experiences of a survivor from the Indian setting, whom I have been accompanying closely over the last 2 years, in order to point to some aspects of the trauma endured by women who are victims of sexual violence. I offer this as a case study, clergy sexual abuse being a grave sickness afflicting the Catholic Church across the globe. I'm referring here to a concrete case of sexual violence involving a bishop in India, a case that has had wide media coverage. Towards the end of June 2018, a nun belonging to a diocesan congregation filed a case against her bishop, accusing him of abusing her sexually over a period of 2 years between 2014 and 2016. It took the nun almost a year to disclose her suffering to anyone, and to her shock, the priest she spoke to in confession, because confessional was their only space where she could confide in anybody, instead of listening to her, scolded her. For some, she was at fault for giving him a chance to use her. Some others spiritualize, saying that if a priest or bishop has this weakness, God intends that nuns pray for them, that they may overcome it. Utterly confused and numb with a sense of shame, mixed with fear, guilt, anger, and sadness, she could only indulge in self-pity. She was petrified at the consequences if this was brought to light, the offender being none other than the bishop of her diocese and the patron of her congregation, as theirs was a diocesan order. When she could not contain her turmoil anymore, she decided to go for a retreat, and it was there that she got the courage to call a spade a spade. This became the turning point in her life, and on her return, she got the courage to resist his advances and to report the abuse to her congregational leadership and to the church authorities. While the trauma of concealing the suffering was unbearable for this nun, revealing it meant tasting the bitter cup of hostility primarily from her own sisters. And mind you, she was the superior general of that congregation, who became the congregational leader rather young, when she was just 28 years. Except for 5 younger nuns who decided to stand by her, come what may, the rest of the congregation turned hostile when they realized that she had dared to point a finger at the bishop who was their patron. The congregational leadership removed the survivor from her role as the superior of the local community and took away from them the mission of the senior citizens' home and the working women's hostel they were managing. Instead, they appointed another group of 3 sisters who supported the bishop to take over the administration of the local community and its apostolate. You know, even now when I visit that community, sometimes I think it is unique and the rarest of religious communities in the world, where you have under the same roof and sharing the same table, 2 groups of nuns, one supporting the survivor and the other group supporting the offender. While the companions of the survivor refused to transfer, their names were deleted from the directory of the order. Their trauma relating to harassment within the congregation continues to date, since their leadership is totally under the hegemonic control of the perpetrator bishop. Adding to the agony of this nun was the experience of estrangement she encountered in the church, the space that was meant to be her home. She took the radical step of approaching the civil courts after having knocked at many ecclesiastical doors seeking justice. First, she spoke to her parish priest, who directed her to the local ordinary of the diocese where she was based, who in turn directed her to speak to the head of the local church, which is one of the 3 Catholic rites in India. This prelate washed his hands off, saying that the accused bishop belongs to another rite that is not under his jurisdiction. However, blindly believing that approaching the higher authorities in the church could make a difference, she then wrote to the nuncio, and on being confronted by silence again, she approached the Holy See, sending letters to the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops, and to Pope Francis himself. Again, silence was the response, though she knew on tracking the couriers that the letters were delivered at the Vatican. Finally, she mustered courage to file an FIR, first information report, at the police station against the patron bishop when he began threatening her family members by filing false cases against them. The trauma experienced by the nun got intensified when new stories were invented and circulated by those with vested interests, whose motive was to punish her for daring to speak out. Some claimed that she had entertained a relationship with the bishop for money, and her resistance began when it stopped. For many loyal faithful of the church, her silence in the face of the abuse for 2 years clearly signaled to her consent. While the blame game continued, she continued to suffer in silent tears, shattered by the duplicity of the system that defended the offender while engaging in defamation of the victim. Only the few who reached out to her with genuine care could comprehend the veracity of what had happened and take a stand in solidarity. Before we take a look at the pathways to healing, I would like to draw your attention to another phase of trauma experienced by many Catholics who are concerned about the many instances of clergy sexual abuse and the inappropriate ways of handling the crisis by the church authorities. This is also, in my opinion, an invisible wound on the ecclesiastical body as it results from a systemic problem. To illustrate this, I take again the case of sexual abuse involving the bishop. When the news got flashed by the mainstream media channels, even I came to know about it the day it was flashed because I didn't even know such a congregation existed just 40 kilometers from where I reside. Concerned Catholic feminist organizations like the Indian Women Theologians Forum and Forum of Religious for Justice and Peace wrote to the office bearers of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of India seeking their intervention because we really felt, even though the case has gone to the civil courts, we have to, because it is involving two people within the church, we have to set up a fact-finding commission within the church so as to check objectively the truthfulness of the accusations and to relieve, we also wanted to relieve the accused bishop of his pastoral responsibilities in the diocese where the case, while the case was being investigated, as this could help safeguard the credibility of the church in this country. Most of you may know India is a very religious country with so many religions, and the Catholic Church is a minority. But it's a powerful minority because the Catholic Church runs very powerful educational institutions and healthcare institutions in the country. So when anything, and particularly now with we have since the last maybe 7 years, 8 years, government that is based on religious nationalism, Hindutva politics. So they want to make India a Hindu nation, and any scandal of any other religious minority is taken, is celebrated by the media. So we wanted things, not to go out of hand, even though it had reached the civil courts. So that is why we were deeply concerned about the credibility of the church being safeguarded. However, both these organizations did not receive even an acknowledgement to the letters that were sent. The silence of the church leadership conveyed a powerful message that the pain of the body did not matter to the head. I feel pain even to say that. Here again, the wounding had a gendered nature because majority of those who were crying out for justice from these organizations were women, and their concerns did not matter to the church leaders. When the 5 sister companions of the survivor nun joined the protesters who took to the streets demanding the arrest of the accused bishop since nothing had happened, even after 2 months of filing the case, they were blamed for tarnishing the image of the church. Anybody who supported the survivor nun was told, she or he is the problem because you are spoiling the image of the church. The Kerala Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a statement saying that the protest against the accused bishop had crossed the limits and the stir was unacceptable. While the bishop got arrested, finally, he was visited in jail by many fellow bishops, and no one bothered to pay a visit to the traumatized nun who stood stunned by the ecclesiastical drama unfolding before her. When the bishop was released on bail after 21 days, he was allowed to return to the same diocese, though without administrative responsibilities. There he received a hero's welcome with garlands and singing by his priests and some faithful, and even there were nuns there. And this was televised by many channels, much to the embarrassment and agony of justice seeking Catholics. The double standards meted out by the official church in protecting the abuser and alienating the victim has become the sore spot in this wounding. The deep-rooted gender bias unearthed in this situation raises the question: would a daughter of the ecclesiastical family cease to be one if she dares to expose the incestuous experience of sexual violation by one of the sons of the same family? I now want to look at the possible pathways to healing. Since trauma resulting from any form of gender or sexual violence is intricate, healing is also a slow and difficult process that calls for a critical diagnosis of the problem in all its complexity. Paradoxically, in India, those who are concerned about healing this problem are not the active churchgoers or those holding positions of leadership in the ecclesiastical system, but the ordinary people who are committed to justice, concerns, human rights, and liberation. And for me, this calls to question the whole notion of what it means to be church. The primary concern of those of us seeking justice for the victims of clergy sexual abuse has been the well-being of the survivors. Some of us who are Catholic women with feminist sensibilities in India, we have initiated a new group that we call Sisters in Solidarity, SIS, in order to accompany the survivors on their journey to healing. The main goal of SIS is to stand by the survivors and to safeguard their integrity, particularly in situations where they have experienced estrangement within the church. SIS members have been accompanying survivors, offering different forms of therapy, along with spiritual accompaniment and other support systems that would help them recover their self-respect and dignity. In the case of the survivor nun and her companions, besides counseling sessions and other therapy, SIS has taken steps to engage the sisters constructively by getting them enrolled in postgraduate courses through a distance education program. Because according to the legal system in this country, the trial that began last year, it's still continuing. It takes a very, very long time before an initial judgment is made in the lower courts, then it will go to the High Court of the state and then to the Supreme Court. So it can take, I wonder how many years, I don't know. So that is why we wanted to get them enrolled in postgraduate courses through this distance education program. This has meant motivating them consistently because some of them were not ready, but we really felt we needed to engage them because otherwise they could get into depression. And also finding the necessary funds since their congregation had disowned them totally. SIS has managed thus far thanks to the care of Providence in this venture. Besides SIS, which is an all-women's group, another group called SOS that was started when that initial agitation was going on, demanding the arrest of the bishop. SOS signifies Save Our Sisters. This was started by a group of men at a critical juncture when the case was not finding light due to the strong religio-political influences and the intentions behind it. SOS has become like a civil society organization now that has been consistently engaging in campaigns of justice for the survivors by providing them the much needed legal assistance in their precarious situations. It has been very encouraging to note that at an online Christmas encounter in December 2020, and we have it frequently with them, the sisters, the survivor nun and asserted emphatically that SIS and SOS have been like two wings that have taught her to fly again. In making available the psychological, spiritual, and economic resources necessary for their healing from journey to and in their journey to wholeness, the members of SIS and SOS have given them a sense that they are not alone in the struggle for justice. Ever since its inception, SIS has become a prophetic voice before the Catholic Church leadership in India, challenging them to honor their zero tolerance policy on sexual violence, which has been reiterated on different occasions, starting with the 2010 gender policy of the CBCI and their 2020 National Assembly just last year. SIS has also reminded the church leaders that they are failing in their duty as fathers to reach out to the survivors with care, concern, and support in their struggle. Feminist theologians in India have consistently argued for making a distinction between sin and crime in dealing with clergy sexual abuse. Many holding ecclesiastical authorities see abuses of this nature as sin, which can be absolved at the confession if the abuser expresses repentance. But from the perspective of the survivors, it is not merely a sin that can be absolved, but a crime that needs to be addressed in all its gravity, taking into consideration also the structural factors that facilitate it. Many scholars who have examined the pathological condition of clergy sexual abuse identify clericalism as a major issue behind the inability of the church in addressing this problematic. Clericalism, with its cult of secrecy, its theological misogyny, and its hierarchical power, is identified to be at the root of Roman Catholic dysfunction on this issue. Consequently, sexual abuse and related cover-ups result from what can be termed toxic clericalism. The situation is more critical as canon law gives the ordained many rights and privileges. Accused clerics are not brought before civil courts, but tried by a canonical forum, and canon law is totally impotent to bring about a just church and just society. Considering that ecclesiastical conflicts involving clergy sexual abuse expose structural inequalities, gender imbalance, and power differentials, it calls for a rethinking of ecclesiology. And this calls to question if the church, what the church is all about, whether it is just a ritualistic establishment which does a lot of works of charity, or a community with a prophetic and liberative mission that stands with the broken ones in their darkest moments of vulnerability. Systemic healing also demands that the we need to revisit the theology of priesthood if the ecclesiastical body needs to be healed. Potestas sacra, or sacred power associated with the alter Christus imagery upheld by theology of ministerial priesthood, becomes a fodder for clericalism. Even if priests do not abuse this power, the exaltation of the priest as alter Christus can be very imposing in a spiritual sense on the Christian faithful, particularly children and women who are vulnerable to abuse. In the Indian context, as far as women religious are concerned, there is need for a serious rethinking also on the theology of religious life. Their romanticized theological identity as brides of Christ, which is strongly upheld by some women religious. The infantile manner in which religious obedience is interpreted and practiced by some. The systemic denial of their spiritual agency because of their over dependence on the clergy in religious practices, etc., since all these make them extremely vulnerable to clerical abuse. Unless and until the gender imbalance at every level of ecclesial life is corrected, and the church cannot recover its spiritual health and integrity as the body of Christ in this world. To conclude, handling sexual conflicts within the church would imply going beyond the avoidance syndrome and seeing it as a crisis calling for healing, purification, renewal, and authentic humanization of the church as an institution. For this to happen, it is not sufficient to make policies at the level of episcopal conferences or even at the Vatican. It calls for an ecclesiogenesis, borrowing this expression from Leonardo da Vinci, which speaks of reinventing the church from below. Perhaps the unresolved issue of clergy sexual abuse is a wake-up call, reminding the church of the urgency for this ecclesiogenesis to happen, whereby it can recover its lost health by becoming a body that is more humane, non-hierarchical, and inclusive, like the incarnated Christ. Consequently, the church will rediscover its true vocation and mission as a wounded yet liberative healer in this world. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abraham, for starting our conference in such a powerful way, as well as for staying within time limits. So thank you. You made my job very, very easy this morning as well. Our second speaker, so thank you. Our second speaker today is Reverend Dr. Elisee Rutagambwa. He's a Jesuit priest from Rwanda with degrees in philosophy and theological social ethics. For the last 4 years, he has been teaching in Nairobi at Hekima University College, and he also serves as a deputy dean at the Nairobi's Hekima Institute of Peace Studies and International Relations. In the course of his academic career, he taught at Boston College, Major Seminary in Bujumbura, Burundi, and the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University in California. He has contributed a number of papers in international fora on social ethics and genocide studies, and teaches courses on a range of topics, including human rights, ethics of war and peace building, Christian social ethics, Catholic social teaching, and exodus and genocide. Dr. Rutagambwa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. So before I begin my presentation, let me begin by sending my warm greetings to each one of you and to our audience, and express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference roundtable. I'm particularly indebted to Dr. Bill and Karen, who conveyed the invitation and allowed me to be part of this conversation. Let me now share my slides. All right. So my topic is trauma healing and reconciliation in post-genocide Rwanda, a complementary and dialectical approach. Following the shift in warfare from interstate to intrastate wars that has characterized the Cold War period, the world has been confronted with unprecedented complex situations surrounding rebuilding societies after mass violence and genocide. Prominent among them is the contestation over the dilemma regarding the prioritization of either trauma healing or reconciliation in the process of peace building and national reconstruction. So focusing on the Rwandan post-genocide context, the present paper first reminds the egregious immediate post-genocide situation and its unprecedented challenges. The second, it highlights the dispute over the prioritization of either trauma healing or reconciliation in the process of reconstruction. Third, building on the lessons learned from the selected trauma healing and reconciliation initiatives, namely Healing Life Wounds initiative that was conducted by Dr. Simon Gasibirege and his Life Wounds Healing Association, and Christian Gacaca, a Catholic Church reconciliation initiative. It maintains that neither the prioritization of trauma healing nor that of reconciliation is a suitable course of action in addressing the post-genocide reconstruction challenges. Instead, it underscores a complementary and dialectical approach that simultaneously fosters trauma healing and reconciliation. And finally, it underlines the role that the Catholic theological ethics can play to sustain both genuine and lasting trauma healing and reconciliation. Let me quickly look at the post-genocide situation and its challenges. So in 1994, Rwanda experienced one of the most atrocious genocide of the 20th century. Following the Hutu extremist government's refusal to implement the peace accord agreed upon in conjunction of the rebel group of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, formerly composed by former Tutsi refugees, the government resorted to the final solution of Tutsis. It immobilized its resources and the entire apparatus, namely its administration, security institutions, including military, police, security services, It is judiciary, it is allied extremist political parties and their youth militia, the media, and conducted the most horrendous extermination that the country had never witnessed before. So using the entire arsenal within their reach, modern weaponry as well as traditional killing instruments, and the following pre-established list of Tutsis, they moved from house to house and mercilessly hacked to death any Tutsi on their passage, including unborn babies, children, men and women, youth and elderly, etc. Women and girls were raped publicly and reduced to sexual slaves after the killing of their loved ones. As a result, many of them were contaminated with HIV/AIDS, and others carried unwanted babies. Mass killings were most conducted in church and Catholic school buildings, stadia, and other places that could gather as many people as possible. In most cases, victims were forced to march to their death places, submitted to all kinds of humiliation, inflicted physical and psychological violence along the way, and eventually killed in the most abject ways. Those who managed to run away or hide were hunted down as savage animals until they were found and butchered or left to die in the wilderness. As Tutsi and Hutus lived together and were even mixed in families, the genocide in Rwanda has been called the intimate genocide. And this explains how it took an extra mile in its inhumanity. It destroyed the most intimate relationships. Parents killed their children and vice versa, pastors their parishioners and vice versa, teachers their students, medical doctors their patients, novice masters abandoned their novices, and religious superiors handed their inferiors to their killers. So after the killings, some victims were thrown into mass graves or pit latrines, and others were left to roast under the sun or served as animals' pittance. Subsequently, all the properties were either stolen or destroyed to the extent that their homes were totally erased. So only in 100 days, more than 1 million Tutsis and Hutus who declined to partake into the killings or protected their Tutsi neighbors were exterminated. So according to the estimates, 1/7 of the Rwandan population perished, and 10,000 people were killed every day, thus making the genocide against the Tutsis one of the fastest in history. After the genocide was stopped, not only was 1 million people dead and others remained still rotting under the sun or in hidden places, but 2 other million had fled the country and thousands of others were internally displaced. So the country counted thousands of orphans, widows, non-accompanied children, uncountable war casualties, physical and mental patients, trauma victims, as well as disabled people. In addition, there were hundreds of thousands of genocide suspects awaiting trials in overcrowded jails, while others remained unidentified and mixed with the rest of the population. On the political front, none of the government institutions were working. On the economic front, all government coffers had been emptied by the fugitives. And in the outside world, most of the bystanders who stopped by while the genocide was unfolding, they were now deeming the country a failed state and had difficulties to mobilize the funds to come to the rescue of the genocide survivors. So instead, they drew all the attention and humanitarian assistance to the refugee camps in disregard that they had been transformed into military camps by the very genocide perpetrators. It was under these circumstances that disputes over trauma healing and reconciliation prioritization emerged among many other dilemmas that the country was facing. And let us see now how the dispute were argued. For those who prioritized the trauma healing, so as Berman noted, referring to the genocide, the magnitude of the prevailing trauma healing trauma in post-genocide Rwanda, I quote, "Nearly every citizen had been affected individually by violence, whether from direct involvement in perpetrating crimes, from personal injury, or from the injury or death of loved ones. As a matter of fact, or post-traumatic symptoms such as intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, suicide attempts were everywhere to be seen. Hence, although there were many priorities, trauma healing was one of them and certainly one of the most urgent. Prominent among those who advocated for the priority of trauma healing were the different associations of genocide survivors, such as IVUCA, which is the umbrella of all genocide survivors associations. So according to them, it was unthinkable to talk about reconciliation as a priority, since they were still hurting from unprecedented trauma experience and still hunted down by the unidentified perpetrators in their midst, who were not only eager to finish up their genocidal agenda, but were also trying to liquidate survivors to erase any possible testimony against them. Besides, even the anger, their outcry was much more to have justice done rather than contemplating the idea of reconciliation. And this priority was also sanctioned in the academia. So academically, some approaches to trauma healing justify the prioritization of individual trauma healing over concerns about restoration of the social relationship, such as those advocated by community or national reconciliation. For example, as is argued in some approaches to psychotherapy, by its very nature, the process of healing from emotional trauma focuses primarily on individual healing. In this perspective, as Brenda highlights, the focus here is on what is best for the individual person, regardless of what might be best for other individuals in similar situations, or what might be in the best interests of the patient's family or community. So as such, the therapist avoids placing the patient as a proxy bed of what would be helpful to victims of trauma as a general rule, or to others in the social environment. In addition, when working with an individual patient, the therapist focuses on providing the patient with optimal care, even if that means excluding other equally deserving patients from his or her practice. Now, for those who prioritize reconciliation, these were mostly motivated by the survival of Rwanda as a nation and the future of its people. So indeed, the genocide had pushed ethnic division to its climax, and there were good reason to believe that national unity was irreparable. On the other hand, most survivors were unconvinced that they would never live with their perpetrators again. Bystanders and scholars were envisioning the partition of the country into Hutu and Tutsi lands as the only lasting solution to post-genocide Rwanda. So reconciliation was therefore the condition of survival, and it needed to be worked out before it was too late. Now, for realistic or optimistic leaders, things did not look as clear-cut and absolutely desperate as they appeared. In fact, although the genocide had indeed escalated ethnic division to its climax and prompted the trauma to the extreme, not all Hutus were anti-Tutsi and vice versa. During the genocide, there were signs of hope, as some Hutus heroically sacrificed their life to save their Tutsi neighbors, and others fought alongside the Rwandan Patriotic Front to stop the genocide. So not everything was compromised. There were still chances to save the nation, and this example indicated that reconciliation was possible and only promising way. So in the academic, new development in warfare and its destructive effects observed at the end of the 20th century had led to revise the classical ways of conflict resolution and peace building. With the emerging hate crimes, their vicious circles and subsequent massive deprivation of lives and psychological trauma, as well as the issues of identity and recognition they raised, the old ways of retaliation and retributive justice could no longer provide appropriate answers. So that's how the arguments fostering reconciliation as one of the most credible and promising alternatives were advanced. So although these two approaches present sound arguments, none of them could have helped with the post-genocide situation alone. Initiatives taken both in trauma healing and reconciliation show that each of them was urgently needed. Therefore, they had to be pursued simultaneously. Let me now look at these two initiatives among others. And I picked them because these are initiatives that are church-related or who involved Christians, and they give us a sense of the issues of church trying to deal with healing. Now, the first one has to do with healing life wounds, and the second one is the Christian Gacaca. In healing life wounds, I look quickly at the origin, development objectives, the methodology, the modus operandi, and the outcome. Now, in terms of the origin, development, and objectives, I rely essentially on the article by Regine King, who was one of co-workers with Dr. Gasibirege. So healing life wounds was initiated in 1995 by Rwandan psychologist, Dr. Simon Gasibirege, whose aim was to bring Rwandans together for mutual healing. So initially implemented his healing life wounds model through NGOs, but soon he noted that it could not be sustainable. That's how he shifted the model to the grassroots and worked essentially with Life Wounds Healing Association, which he founded. Now, what were the objectives? Objective number one was to facilitate the healing of individual wounds and rehabilitate communities affected by the genocide. And the second was to address the subsequent impact of the post-genocide experiences of exile, repatriation, imprisonment, and family brokenness. As you can see, this is dealing essentially with the process of reconciliation. Now, in terms of methodology, they relied essentially on shared experiences through storytelling, guided by a series of exercises and psychoeducation presentations. So these presentations were based on a threefold approach: the Western therapeutic, the spiritual practice of confession, and the Rwandan traditional gacaca, which was basically a mechanism of conflict resolution. But of course, this had to be adapted because the way it operated prior to the genocide, it was mainly for small kind of conflict. Now, for evaluation of the experience, they relied on a dual method. One is the critical ethnography, which has the advantage of not only focusing on universalistic and positivistic perspectives, but on historical and cultural approaches. And the other method was the narrative inquiry, which is a form of qualitative inquiry interested in what human beings are doing, saying, and meaning-making of the information in a given context. And they try to compare this information with the existing narrative. Now, in terms of modus operandi, I wouldn't have to go through the whole thing, but what I note here, which was very relevant, first of all, it was a bottom-up approach. And secondly, it was on a voluntary basis. So people who wanted to participate were given the opportunity to apply and to be approved. So it wasn't a compulsory. People who came with goodwill and they wanted to make progress. And also it meant to create a safe space for establishing guiding principles of confidentiality, respect, autonomy, mutual support, and so forth. So there was a number of models they would look at, and then also set the different groups, make sure they mix the groups so that they can come up with something that is representative. Let me go quickly on the outcome. So here in terms of the outcome, the intervention demonstrated the progress by the participants over time. Original findings showed that through healing life wounds, many participants became aware of psychological wounds experienced personally or collectively. They indicated that sharing personal stories gave them a voice and a confidence. There was a mutuality and compassion. And not everyone, of course, experienced the healing process at the same, in the same way or at the same pace. So sometimes they have to go back and forth. Now, in terms of the findings, on the group which was deemed the most successful went through the whole process, they were looking at understanding and managing the emotions, increased self-acceptance, the acceptance of others, approaching and helping others, and a renewed sense of social identity and belonging. So on these 4 points, they could identify a real progress among these groups. Now let's see in terms of the Christian Gacaca. Here again, I would look at the origin, the different approaches, the context, objectives, and the process, and then the outcome. Now, in terms of the origin, the Gacaca system emerged as the country was facing a serious problem. You have these perpetrators in unprecedented numbers, and you have a broken judicial system. And so the government were looking at alternatives. So that's how the government commissioned a group of academics to try to figure out how this process worked and how it can be converted into a popular court to try the perpetrators. Now, of course, as they come up with the report, there was a divergence here. Among the commissioners, there were some clerics, and there were also some university professors. Now, the government was focusing much more on judicial perspective, whereas the Catholic Church was focusing on mechanism of reconciliation. So they allowed the church to go its own way, and then the government maintained the focus on the judiciary. Now, Christian Gacaca was then pioneered by the Catholic Church and initiated part of the clergy and faithful who recognized their collective responsibility in the tragedy and decided to reconstruct the church anew. So it meant to create a platform for conversation between survivors and perpetrators or their families within the church. Now, in terms of the context, this was a defining moment as the church had been blamed for her reluctance to speak out why innocent Tutsis were being slaughtered in churches and Catholic school buildings, and some of the clerics were involved in the killings. So besides, another part of the church, including Hutu priests who had fled with the perpetrators in refugee camps in DRC, they continued to deny or to minimize the genocide. So it was a time to reconsider the church's attitude. Another factor that contributed to the Christian Gacaca was the 2000-year Jubilee, which was proclaimed by St. John Paul II. So this was corresponded with the centenary of the arrival of the first missionaries in Rwanda. And so they took this opportunity to really make a kind of self-examination and try to see what was the role of the church during the genocide, and take that as a point of departure for engaging the church in the process of reconciliation. Now, as they came together to frame this Christian Gacaca, in most dioceses, they end up realizing that the ethnocentrism was the major problem. And so they wanted to focus Christian Gacaca on this very problem. So on the other hand, since the church had been severely criticized for her role during the genocide and had this strenuous relationship with the government and genocide survivors, the celebration of the Jubilee at the end of the synod served as an opportunity for public apology and the renewal of relationship with the governments, as well as with the genocide survivors. Now, what were the objectives and the process? Objective number one, since they were focusing on reconciliation, they needed to conduct trauma healing. And in Kinyarwanda, which is the language of Rwanda, they call it gusana imitima, which means to repair the hearts or to restore humanity. And the second objective was, of course, forgiveness and reconciliation. And that's why they were relying on the sacrament of reconciliation. In terms of the process, so Gacaca was placed in the context of preparing for the synod, and there were commissions that gathered people from around the Catholic Church in Rwanda. So they trained facilitators and set up structures from the dioceses to parish levels. Now, the synod facilitators included priests and basic Christian communities leaders, and the audience were learners or students, religious communities, prisoners, intellectuals, families, etc. Opening the synod was marked by the presence of the bishop and all his clergy, and they wanted to be the ones explaining what were the objectives and the process of Gacaca. So they conducted sessions following the methodology protocol, where some of these principles were supposed to be focused on confidentiality, truth telling, mutual respect, And there was also the commitments to ask and grant forgiveness. So there was the Isana meeting, which is trauma healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And at the end, there was sessions of testimony where they would evaluate what was the outcome. Now, in terms of the outcome, there were some tangible achievements, rehabilitation of genocide survivors, Gacaca diffused the tensions and favored mutual healing, genuine confession and forgiveness, renewal of relationship and common enterprise. Here you would have, for example, former perpetrators who offered services or gifts to survivors and who started intermingling. There was also common participation in worship and pastoral work. But this Christian Gacaca, because of the context and because of the prior attitude of the church, registered some weaknesses. And one of them was the lack of common policy. So each diocese went its own way. Some dioceses did begin in time, others delayed, some for good reasons. There was one of the northern diocese of Nigeria, for example, they couldn't do it because the province was involved in a warfare. There were some infiltrators of former perpetrators who would come in the country. So it was so much insecure. Now, there was also instances of re-traumatization. Although they had some precautions to create a safe environment, as people would tell their stories, they would go back to trauma. There were different approaches. In some dioceses, they focused on ethnocentrism. Others, they just considered as one of the issues along issues related to family or related to social other problems. So no clear criteria for evaluation of the outcome was set. So there was only one diocese, the Archdiocese of Kigali, where there was a commission which tried to make some kind of evaluation. And also there was a lack of common strategy for continuity. So it was meant to be done during that period of time, which went up to the Jubilee. And then after the Jubilee, it shifted mostly to the Commission of Unity and Social Justice. Now, as you can see, there was no way of focusing on one. If I support this complementary dialectical approach, is first of all because of the lesson learned from some of these successful initiatives, but there's also something that has to do with, that is proper to the approach itself. And so I would also look at the role theological ethics can play in terms of enhancing this approach. Now, what are the lessons learned from the initiatives? First of all, both took seriously the complementary dialectical approach to trauma healing and reconciliation. This was in their objectives, it was in the process, and you could see that there was a mutual influence between the trauma healing initiatives and reconciliation initiatives. Also, because of that approach, these two initiatives were among the most successful, although at equal basis, as I suggested. Now, in terms of healing life wounds, it was more effective and even instrumental to Christian Gacaca, as it helped to train some of the facilitators and they shared their therapeutic skills. It lasted longer as it took time to allow voluntary participation, conscientization, prior training in terms of relevant subjects such as history, such as human rights, such as the notion of violence and non-violence, etc. And offered room for creativity, evaluation on a length of time to confirm the outcome. So people were not just subject to this intervention, they became actually creative because they are the ones who created the association to be able to take the experience to their own families and to their communities. It even later extended to neighboring countries. Dr. Gasbirege was able to go to Congo, DRC, to Burundi, and bring people together and try to work out effort of reconciliation during the conflict between these countries. Now, in terms of Christian Gacaca, it did some big difference, and it was able to achieve tangible successes. So prior to the initiative, the church was paralyzed. It was divided, it was self-defensive, it was in denial, and enclosed to herself. But the initiative helped the church seize the opportunity to play her beautiful role of reconciling itself, and it is faithful. In addition to the successes mentioned in the outcome, Christian Gacaca helped the church improve her relationship with the government and the survivors, apologize for her members responsible for genocidal actions, support and promote the process of healing and reconciliation within the church and in society at large. So although the Christian Gacaca helped a lot, the outcome could have been better. That's why I support a complementary and dialectical approach in the following point, and I would also appeal to theological ethics and show how it can serve as a collective addenda to what lacked or was less explored in Christian Gacaca. Now, for a complementary and dialectical approach, why do I think this approach is relevant and is one of the best course of action? The first point has to do with the unusual and complex character of post-massive violence situation. You have a massive population involved, you have massive distraction, you have multiple dilemmas, and working classical ways of response, and the imperative of peace and reconstruction. So if you want to go the way of retribution, and you have to try half of the country or even more than half of the country, then who is going to be in the effort of reconstruction? So you are totally paralyzed. That's why you need to work out other ways. And the trauma healing and reconciliation bring this nicely, because perpetrators and survivors can come up together, even though it is hard, it is painful, but it is the only way that this country could come out. Now, there's also the inefficiency of linear progress approaches and the need to restore to a complementary dialectical approach that allows more dynamics and creativity. So some of the traditional ways where you work out reconciliation following a determined process from one stage to another, it doesn't work, because some people might make some strides in trauma healing, but in the process, if something happens, like for example, when we had former perpetrators who were repatriated, so it took them back to the era of genocide. And so those who had managed to make strides in terms of healing were falling back into trauma. So it's not a linear process. It is much more dialectical. 2 steps forward, 1 step behind, and so forth. But there is also the nature of the relationship between the perpetrators and the victims. They are somehow have a bondage. As Morrison says in one of her novels, when you kill somebody, you own him. So there is no way you can just distance from it. So the perpetrators and the victims had to heal together. Otherwise, each one would stay where he was and with the grievances he had before. Now, the specific nature of the relationship in a communitarian society, that's another point that really advocates this approach. Because in most African societies, as you know, people are so communal. I am because we are, as Villavicencio says, explaining the process of the TRC. So people are in some kind of bond. There is no way they can, one can heal without the other. So that's why the process is so relevant. Now, what would be the contribution of the Christian ethics, which was not fully enough explored during the Christian Gacaca? Here there is the whole notion of healing and reconciliation. It's not a simple human thing. It is a conjoined gift of God. And so there's an appeal to a higher order, which removes the tension, the duality between perpetrators and survivors, but make them aspire to something bigger, where each one can still find a way of restoration. Trauma healing and reconciliation also, in this perspective, are seen as spirituality more than strategies and managed processes. And so there is a sense of a holistic sense of the person. It's not just like I do A, B, C, D and click and things happen. Trauma healing and reconciliation, they generate both the perpetrator and the victim and makes them a new creation. So it's not like going back to the original relationship, But this time, it's like understanding from the brokenness that has taken place, how both of them can be restored and aspire to something higher, which is supported by the power of God, not the only human power. Now, the trauma healing and reconciliation helps a new narrative. So this is the new narrative that is founded on the story of the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Of course, I can elaborate more on this, but given the time, let me just name it. Now, there's also theological resources. The rituals and sacraments, for example, we have in the Catholic Church, if they are appealed, because these are part of the way of life, it is not like one intervention like in some of these psychological approaches. So from the greetings of peace to Eucharist, to baptism, sacrament of the sick or reconciliation, there is a way of really bringing people together on a different level. And it appeals to what is really far ahead, far deeper in their lives. There's also the symbolic images from the scripture. When you think about the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the lost sheep. So these are very, very eloquent symbols that help people to relate to their own experiences. There's also the paradox of the cross, which is at the same time passion and resurrection. At the same time, it helps me to understand the brokenness and the pain and what has come up with the genocide. But at the same time, it is the symbol of love. That is the horizon towards which people can go to rebuild, their humanity and to rebuild their nation. There's also the nature of the Christian community, which is at the same time a community that reaches to the grassroots, but what is also a mirror image of the kingdom. The fact that the church reaches out to the grassroots, it has more opportunities to bring people together and to create, through its pastoral work, channels of keeping up this process of reconciliation and having a way of sustaining it. So in conclusion, it springs from the above initiatives and subsequent reflection inspired by theological ethics and the response of the complexities of post-genocide or any other situation of mass violence required to conduct trauma healing at the same time as reconciliation. Nonetheless, it is important to remember that each case has its own distinctive context and presents its own particularities. Therefore, it is not wise to assume that there is a universal recipe varied everywhere and at any given time, be it a sound and reasonable course of action. While we highly recommend a complementary dialectical approach and appreciate its holistic character, which is instrumental in human societies under similar circumstances as Rwanda, it is crucial to pay attention to each case in its distinctiveness and always keep an open window for flexibility and creativity. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rutagambwa, for this talk, which for me at least highlighted and brought to light the tensions and the competing claims between reconciliation processes and healing processes and their interconnection. So thank you very much. I do want, before turning to our next speaker, the last one in this round table, I want to encourage the audience to submit their questions using the Q&A tool, which is, I believe, on the bottom of your screens. So please submit your questions as our speakers are giving their remarks. Our third speaker today, and the last one for this morning, is Dr. Claudio de Oliveira Ribeiro, a Brazilian Methodist theologian with degrees in theology from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. After completing his postdoctoral research internship at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, he currently serves as a visiting professor in the graduate program in religious studies at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora. He's also an advisor to the base ecclesial communities of the Catholic Church in Brazil, ecumenical groups, and popular movements. His teaching and research experience are largely focused on the topics of religious pluralism, theology and culture, theological anthropology, Christology, ecumenism, and human rights. The floor is yours.
I am very happy and grateful to be able to participate in the World Catholicism Week 2001. I would like to thank Dr. William Canova, director of CWCIT, for the invitation. And I bring a lovely embrace from the ecclesial communities in Brazil to all who participate in this event. The theme, Rise Up and Walk, Catholicism and Healthcare Across the Globe, is of fundamental importance, and we hope to both contribute and learn from the experience of people from different parts of the world. I would like to add my thanks for the both words, powerful words from our friend from India and our friend from Africa. It's a big challenge for me to speak after them, and I have really to thank them for this word. My focus is the pandemic. The pandemic caused by the coronavirus has had different consequences for the world in different dynamics of life. These consequences generate crises not only in the scope of public health and in the economic sphere, but also in the most diverse subjective, interpersonal, and social aspects. The physical and emotional fragility of human beings has never been so explicit and exposed, at least not in recent times. Traumas and invisible wounds abound in our reality. At the same time, however, different forms of human solidarity and creativity also emerge from this picture. The concerns and fears surrounding the pandemic have sparked reactions of varying degrees around the world. Among them, we highlight the reinforcement of different forms of spirituality, religious or otherwise, to help face issues related to death, physical and emotional fragility, and social isolation. Likewise, especially due to the confinement and economic implications of pandemic, different aspects of human coexistence impacted social, collective, and interpersonal relationships, with the most diverse results, highlighting and accentuating the difficulties in human relationships and social insensitive, now favoring acts of solidarity and fostering reflections on new possibilities for understanding and organizing life. All of these aspects, both complex and challenging, highlights significant paths for life in general and in particular for spiritual experience. The diversity of religious response to the pandemic situation was not and has not been small. They have encompassed everything from the presence of negationist and ideological religious forms to others that are characterized by dialogue with science, human sensitive to suffering, and maturity in the search for attitudes that emphasize social responsibility in the face of the harmful effects of the situation. It is necessary to look at the pandemic that has plagued the world in the context of necropolitics. Among the various negative aspects of the difficult and dramatic situation generated by the pandemic, there are some aspects that reveal possibilities for a reorganization of society, both in terms of personal experience and the daily life, as well as in looking at our social structures. Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Souza Santos called these possibilities a cruel pedagogy of the virus, the title of one of his recent books. The pandemic revealed that the economic system that structures society, even with variations between countries and continents, does not meet the demands of human dignity or basic human rights. The situation in Brazil, but also in several other parts of the globe, has shown that the risks and major problems are concentrated in poorest sector of society, and the realities of prison population, slum areas, and homeless people have become ever more dramatic. The peripheries, with their precarious housing, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation, are the communities that suffer the most from the pandemic outbreak. The virus, bacteria, or any other microorganism responsible for any outbreak like this does not choose people. Everyone is subject to contagion. However, it can be more serious for those who are already vulnerable or have chronic disease. Brazilian society, for example, which is racialized and marked by inequality, showed how racial division, forms of machismo, and economic disparities were exacerbated by the devastating impact of the pandemic, amplifying and intensifying the genocide of Black and indigenous Brazilians. Necropolitics, with its ideological background and colonial origin, permeates social life. The organization of human space, for example, generates non-places where the law has no validity. Death is trivialized, and there is no justice or accountability for murders and deaths. The pandemic has made this reality even more evident. In large urban centers, the levels of contamination and mortality and the amount of people who cannot adopt social distance, especially due to working and transportation conditions, reflect this division of space, this non-space. The concept of necropolitics can be related to the sacrificial logic that emerged in the context of the pandemic, mainly due to some of its structuring elements, such as the fictional creation of an enemy. China's communism, for example, the strengthening of ties of enmity, and the notion of the state of exception. This is the religious dimension of necropolitics. During the pandemic, this racist and anti-democratic face has been revealed, allowing us to perceive in the expiatory sacrifice a face of the necro-religion. Much of the reflections have highlighted the consequences of the pandemic, although it is recognized that an in-depth view of its cases is of great opportunity for raising awareness about other forms of political, social, cultural, and spiritual views. This could reinforce the sustainability of life and of world, as well as indicate the necessary criticism of the current economic system and the inclusive, exclusive way in which society is organized. It's not insignificant that there were signs of decreased pollution in large cities during the initial period of social isolation from March to July 2000, and a reduction in unrestrained consumption. The expression used by the Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff in the title of one of his articles is an example of this reality. To return to normalcy is to condemn to yourself. This is the sentence of Leonardo Boff. To return to normalcy is to condemn to yourself. This reality applies mainly to women. The situation of social isolation transferred professional work activities to the home environment, creating problematic situations for many women and children, being forced to live with abusive men. The restriction of travel makes it impossible for women to visit or seek refuge in their closest network, where their family or friends, and they are exposed to the most diverse forms of violence, the women. Therefore, this pandemic is one of the serious global and planetary impact, crossing several dimensions of daily life. With regard to interpersonal relationships and issues related to family contexts and aspects of daily life, the pandemic also has one positive aspect. At the level of human solidarity, our common pain seems, at least in part, to awaken our sensitivities and a spirit of solidarity. Despite a greater indifference in some groups, some people are more protected than others, the current situation reveals everyone's vulnerability. The crisis, therefore, seems to be an aid in awakening our solidarity with our elderly neighbors, with the most vulnerable people in society, and patients who are in hospitals. The streets and squares of the city of São Paulo in Brazil, for example, know the protest of Father Julio Lancelotti and his team in working with people living on the streets. Health in this project is understood in a holistic, integral way, ranging from care in situation of hunger and health to defense of the base elements of human rights for this group. This is very important in our discussion. In the pandemic crisis, all these efforts needed to be multiplied. These efforts are a concrete example of saying to people, rise up and walk. When defined as a global crisis, the pandemic of the new coronavirus, more than in other dramatic social situations, reveals the crisis of the economic system that creates grave health risks and shows more clearly the signs of necropolitics established in various parts of the world. Such a framework requires new sensitivities, another global policy, and the confrontation of local and national administrations based on the supreme value of life. Look, let us look more closely at the relationship between the pandemic and religious experience. In the social and cultural context of the pandemic, many religious themes and arguments have stood out in conversations and debates, whether due to the atmosphere of negating the virus stimulated by some groups, or the search for broader and well-founded understandings of the phenomenon that are social in nature. How can we better understanding this situation is a question that several groups has asked, and different sectors have dedicated themselves to reflect on it. Both the most spontaneous forms of spirituality and the most traditional or institutionalized religious expressions are present in the debate about the pandemic and social isolation. Both have marked the lives of many people and groups and have been present in different ways in each situation they face. The forms and characteristics of these spiritualities and religious experience are very different. Some of them, with many variations and nuances, are articulated by ideological elements. They are also traversed by economic regions, almost always as a fundamental solution key, and often as the main criterion for deciding on contagion containment strategies. There was no shortage of people who stated explicitly or otherwise that saving the economy was more important than preserving lives. The first staging view at least three vigorous expressions, most of them with strong popular attachment, and are present in the Latin American Catholic context. One of these expressions is characterized following emerging views in society in the political field by the denial of the pandemic's drama. In this perspective, the relationship with the relativism of the true present in political discourse about the pandemic becomes clear, and even more, it shows the challenges for the understanding of Christian light in coherence with the evangelical truth. Another expression attributes the spread of the disease to God's wrath and punishment for human sins, especially those associated with sexual freedom and the use of the humor or the relativization of traditional religious values. Many people think that because of this, we are suffering with the pandemic situation. In this view, the pandemic and its respective health and economic impacts signify an action by God to punish humanity, which had lost its moral course. Several Catholic priests and evangelical pastors, especially two who have a certain presence in the media, publicize this view. Another expression of this set of religious views highlights, in the context of the pandemic, the religious elements as opposed to the scientific one. Generally speaking, such religious readings persist parallel to the science, and sometimes they take their place. There are groups that put God or the devil as the cause of the virus, and therefore offer solutions, rituals, worship services, anointing with hours, novenas, prayer chains, crucifix on the door, holy water sprinkled on the street, procession with the Blessed Sacrament. We have all this religious experience. Until now, I am talking about the first set of religions understanding about pandemic situation. There is a second set of approaches and forms of spirituality of a more intimist character that highlight the importance of devotional life, prayers, and meditation as a way to inner balance, considering that the current times are of uncertainty and insecurity. They are not necessarily anti-scientific, but they do not have the critical scope that the time and circumstances of the pandemic require. Secular media has intensely disseminated this expression of spirituality. These religious approaches are marked by the search of overcoming, or in some cases, escaping their own limits and anxieties, and do not always highlight the most critical religious dimensions for coping with the crisis or with crisis situations. In this sense, it's necessary to be aware of the limits of the strong, intimist spiritualities. There is a third set of expression of spirituality whose interpretations of faith are more consistent and are also present in different groups and Christian churches and in different religions. They are connected with the social political aspects evidenced in the social crisis revealed by the pandemic and anchored in the principles of solidarity, communion, and responsibility with the destinies of life and the world. This view has a theological foundation. The Brazilian theologian Maria Clara Bigeman stresses that talking about God in the context of the pandemic requires, in a more intense and responsible way, a dialogue with science, leaving it full autonomy in the field and competence that are its own. This requires not mixing epistemologies or treating what concerns the biological field with falsely spiritual instruments, which kill rather than cure, and feed genocidal policies capable of punish people to contagion and probably to death. Another woman, Magali Cunha, she is outstanding leader of the ecumenical movement, when analyzed the causes of the pandemic, refutes supernaturalist religious interpretation and highlights the importance of a faith articulate with social and human conscience. The author criticizes the market society which is based on the capitalist need for endless profit growth. The author also emphasizes that this needs to be a time of opportunity, redemption, and hope to think about an ecological and fair world organized around care, not centered on humans, but that seeks the harmony of all beings that inhabit the same land, our common house. This view is the one that makes possible several initiatives in the field of health care. Among the Catholic groups, the testimony of the Franciscan team led by Father Diego Atalino de Mello is very beautiful, and both in the city of Rio de Janeiro and in São Paulo, they take care of the health of people living on the streets. This view is the one that makes possible several initiatives in the field of health care. This Franciscan vision understands that taking care of health includes the struggle for housing, food, work, and other basic conditions of life which are denied. This is very important for our discussion about health. Health includes the struggle for housing, food, work, and other basic conditions for life which are denied. Groups like this are diverse across the country, including Catholics and Protestants, other secular groups, many of them led by women, and they concretely represent the expression rise up and walk. Finally, I just want to emphasize once again how much the pandemic caused by the coronavirus has evidenced the crisis and the injustices of this economic system in which society is structured, as well as the erosion of the vital process and nature caused by the destructive human actions based on profit. In this context, religious experiences, including those of Catholic groups, have highlighted the simultaneous presence of obscurantists and denialist forms on the other hand, and others that, on the contrary, are characterized by dialogue with the science, by the maturity of social responsibility, and by human sensitivity. This last set of religious experience has shown that there is a movement in society of groups that are sensitive to aspects of human fragility and open to the tasks of facing them. Such experiences have been marked by spontaneous, creative, and plural expressions of spirituality that, in their own way, favor perspectives of hope. There are many voices saying, rise up and walk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ribeiro, for your presentation, which I'm sure is going to open there's going to be a lot of material for the conversation. I do see that we have several questions, and so I want to thank the audience for those questions. I will start, and I can invite Dr. Abraham and Dr. Rutagambwa to also come back, perhaps, so we can all join the conversation at this point. The first two questions, which I'm going to read, are for all three of you. So maybe you can take turn and instead of trying to respond to them, depending on the work you do and the kind of insights and experiences you can bring from that work. So the first question is, what steps toward healing would you advise for Black and Brown communities in the United States who are harmed or attacked by different hate crimes and police brutality? So this is a question for all of you. What kind of, perhaps, what pieces of advice or suggestions, ideas you might have in order to address this really big problem in the United States? Maybe start with Dr. Abraham, then we can move to Dr. Rutagambwa and then Ribeiro, just in that order, in the way that you were presenting. Yeah.
You know, certainly the question reflects deep pain of people affected by racist violence. You know? And I would think there is no instant solution. Like you take few tablets and it's healed all over the globe for blood pressure or diabetes, or it is not that. We have to, particularly considering the attacks on Black and colored people, I think we have to consider the deep rootedness of the sickness, because we are dealing with health. It is not just emerging from one person's violent behavior. There is a whole trajectory leading to that. And that is why I feel it is still the undiagnosed, unhealed part of societal health. It has been transmitted from one generation to another. So I would think, like all these kind of, now the wounds are very raw in the recent attacks, on George Floyd and all that has happened after that, and even just the last week. So as I would see, whether it is attack on gender violence or racial violence, it needs a multi-pronged approach. One thing is recourse to law, which has to be very, very serious. Justice. There is no going back on this issue of justice. That is why the Black Lives Matter movement had global repercussion. People demanding justice. We demonstrated on the streets here, in my hometown, because we felt it was our pain too. That is one approach. Another approach, I was just thinking, what is the church doing? Like, so church is supposed to be an agent exercising healing. Can the church become the catalyst by becoming visibly inclusive, visibly non-racial? Can the church testify to that? And when I mean the church, I don't mean just the hierarchy. I mean the community. I mean our institutions. I mean, and that I think can help to undo, erase the historical baggages of racial discrimination that we carry along. So we have to work in very many different ways. And one, because it's the same virus, whether it is in racism, whether it is in sexism, caste, it is the same virus of hierarchical thinking. Who is superior to whom? Who can be the scapegoat? Who can be targeted to take out personal anger, communal anger? So this has to be seen in multiple ways.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abraham. Dr. Rutagambwa.
Thank you. I must say this is a very complex situation. It's not like something would compare. When we had the genocide, it was stopped. And so when we talk about trauma healing and reconciliation, It is a post-genocide thing. Whereas this racial hatred is an ongoing, built-in in the society. And so it is so complex, touches people in different ways. That's why this approach I was advocating for, complementary and dialectical, is very relevant here. First of all, the dimension of individual to individual or communities to communities, but there are also structural aspect to it. So you cannot simply put it in stages and say we start by here, and as if it is a recipe that you have to go through, because people go through different dynamics. But of course, let me talk about the structural level. So racism is not simply about behavior, it's about interest, about history, it's about culture. And so if you really want this to stop, you have to start addressing those structural questions, because without that, you might have individual solutions here and there, but it would not get away. And one of those structures, the way people inhabit. So if you are always separate, there is no common ground, there is nowhere you can meet each other as to not to regard the other through the perspective of this race issue. See an artist, see a doctor, see a lawyer, see all these other identities. It's very difficult to be able to go around this. And what racists fail to understand is that one infliction, like in the case of Freud, people who have been submitted that kind of violence would feel as a repetition, not directed to an individual somewhere, but to themselves. So there are issues here of addressing justice issues, opportunities issues, and at the same time, trying to work it out through individuals and the communities. So there are so many layers of going about this problem. For example, I noticed after the death of Freud, you could see that there are people who were shocked and who, white people who realized that this is just too much and started joining the Black Matters movement. So from that, there is a way to build up a strong movement and help out to push, because structural justice doesn't occur just like that. You need really some advocacy. You need people who work for it. Sometimes people sacrifice for it. Yeah. So there is no one recipe that or stages that you can go through. There are so many dimensions to the problem that needs to be addressed in different contexts at different levels.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rutagambwa. Dr. Ribeiro.
I would like to thank the question, because the violence is a big problem in the world. I think the situation in the United States from Black people, there is a positive side to show for everybody in the world that we are facing a real problem. And if we are in the South or in the North, the violence is present in our society. In Brazil, as you know, our country was founded in the violence from Spanish people, Portuguese people, after that, other people. And because of this, we have in our DNA, I don't know, in our heritage, the violence. And now, in the last decades, we have a problem because we overcome a period of dictatorship, a military dictatorship that was very, very violent. But we didn't do real positions to overcome. In fact, we we make a kind of agreement, but the mentality of violence is present in different kinds of the police. And black young people, for example, in poor areas, they suffer the violence every day. But nobody knows because the media is not showing. Now people are recording because we are facing a new situation in the world of the communication. And many young people is recording and trying to show what has happened in terms of violence with poor people. But some voices who become and protesting the situation, sometimes they are killed. For example, a young woman called Marielle Franco in Rio de Janeiro is a young leader in political field, was killed because she was working against the militias, the parallel groups of policemen. And this situation is very challenging, and I think churches has to reflect on, to act about this, and to ask the real basis that are behind the situation, especially the economic interests.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ribeiro. I have a second question, which is also for all of you, and this one comes from Bill Kavanagh. A question is, what difference does it make that sexual abuse and genocide are inflicted by humans, but the pandemic is inflicted by nature? This is it's a question that made me pause as well. So if I can, maybe somebody would like to start first. Maybe we can start again with Dr. Abraham, but I don't want to be the one to tell Dr. Abraham to always begin the answers. So again, to repeat it, what difference does it make that sexual abuse and genocide are inflicted by humans, but the pandemic is inflicted by nature? There are so many ways to tackle this one.
To respond to that, sorry, shall I say?
No, absolutely. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I wouldn't consider, these are humans and that is nature. I am a person, I see the problem, whether it is genocide, whether it is sexual violence or pandemic, it is all interconnected. Because humans going against humans, in all the violence that we've been hearing over the last more than an hour and in our lifetime, is very much reflected in humans going against nature. And this is now like people are opening up to agree that the pandemic is human made. Okay, that it is like, nature caving in because it can't take anymore. I'll just give one example. It's like, for me, the human body and the body of nature in connection with the humans, it's all. Like some years ago, when I was going through a personal crisis in my life and a very extremely trying time, in terms of work and less sleep, and I developed arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, which is a very autoimmune disease. And when and I really had to slow down, listen to the body, use different means of healing myself, allowing myself to be healed. And when the pandemic erupted, I really felt what my body spoke to me. Some years ago, the body of the earth is telling aloud that it can't take anymore, the stress and strain. So I wouldn't see the problem is in isolation. I feel it is deeply interconnected, and therefore the healing, whether it is a response to the pandemic or genocide or violence of any form, we have to see it in interconnectedness. And more inclined to, even we need spiritual tools for that, the spirituality of interbeing. I think that spiritual awakening has come, and I think that's where the church has a very important role to play, to moving beyond mere rituals, and people have to awaken to that experience of interbeing with other human beings and with nature. So everything is deeply connected.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abraham. I'm hearing sort of some things that are resonating from the first set of answers, which is the interconnections that exist, in the way that we address problems that are human problems, even if they are started within nature, right? Dr. Rutagambwa.
Yeah, I think there is a difference, but there's also a connection. The difference is whether it is sexual abuse or genocide, there is a selected target, and this target is vulnerable by the conditions. Like if for a woman she's being abused, she's in a vulnerable situation, and there's some power involved. And genocide, the same thing. You have a targeted group, and the intent is to erase this group, which makes it very, very distinctive with other crimes. The pandemic comes, it is for everybody. So we have seen poor and rich die, we have seen, so it's not really targeting specific individuals. And because of that, it galvanizes a lot of solidarity. But at the same time, genocide is ideological. It is linked to a whole set of ideas people formulate for themselves. And so we have seen that the very people who are minorities, who are vulnerable, they suffered more the pandemic than others. Why? Because of that perception of these people, how irrelevant they are, how their lives are not dignified. And so there is a neglect. And as we speak today, for example, if you look at the way the vaccine are distributed worldwide, the rich countries are topping about 6%, whereas the developing countries, especially Africa, it's 0.1 accessibility to the vaccine. So this is not simply something that happens like that. It's linked to the whole history, how Africa is being seen by the other world. Of course, we were blessed because we didn't suffer the pandemic the way people expected. People were able to address it seriously. And so we're not as much affected as it was predicted. But you can see the whole prejudices about Africa is playing into the way the distribution of pandemic is being made. So that's the kind of relationship I would establish. But in normal situation, when it comes to natural disasters, you find the poor people are more in solidarity, and the response is really is very engaged. Whereas the sexual abuse or genocide, you find there's a lot of denial about them. You find like people are so indifferent, there's a lack of empathy. But when it comes to natural disaster, everyone feels like he's the target, and so there's that kind of move to be able to do something about it.
So there is a sense of more suffering is more universal in that regard. Dr. Ribeiro.
Would you like to thank Bill for the question? As I said before, the pandemic situation shows us a real situation of life, especially the forms of the organization of our society. Like a mirror, the situation shows us the suffering. We had the suffering before, but in the pandemic situation, we can see clearly. And as I said, Boaventura de Souza Santos, a cruel pedagogy of the virus. In Brazil, for example, there are many groups of women multiplying their efforts about the violence. especially the domestic violence, of familiar violence. If you think, for example, a poor family before the pandemic situation, the husband or he can go for 8 hours or more, 10 or 12 hours outside of the house to work. If he doesn't has a job, he was in the bar drinking or playing football or anything. This moment is very important for the wife, because she could socialize and to do her own things, to care children in a nice way. But now she or they, the women, they have to face this mad and violent man 24 hours per day. Of course, the numbers of violence intensified a lot. And I think the pandemic is to understand the situation, the pandemic situation, you have to brought the nature and the human and the economic and all aspects to understand better the situation. Because it's not only the pandemic, but the social isolation that came with the pandemic situation. This is our debate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ribeiro. So we reached a point where if we were all in Chicago, I would say let's complete this formal part of the conversation and let's continue it informally over coffee and tea. However, we live in this virtual world, and so the organizers tell me that there is a copy of transcript of this question and questions submitted by the audience, and you will each receive the questions from the audience. You'll be able to respond that way, at least as a way, because there are 5, 6 more questions that are for individual speakers. But I do want to say that, this is the moment we complete this segment of the conversation. I want to thank you all 3 for such a great start of the conference this morning. I also want to thank all the audience for joining us and for the questions they submitted. The next roundtable begins at 11 o'clock Central Time, and it's titled Catholic Healthcare Services and Strategies. And I know some of you who are in the audience registered for a breakout chat. So please, you can log out and log in for this breakout chat. To everybody else, enjoy your break. Thanks again to the speaker. Thank you very much to the speakers, and enjoy your day or evening, Dr. Abraham, from what I understand. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
See you all in 30 minutes then. Yes.
Thank you.